All right, we're going to go through some of the rhythm patterns for the Stars and Stripes Forever Rhythm Play Along before we go through it together. Here's the first section. Notice you're going to play this pattern 8 times. And something else tells us to go back and do that again. Does anybody remember what this symbol is called? And that is called the repeat sign. Remember, it has that double bar line and then has the 2 dots that tells us to go back and repeat everything that's in front of it. So this would be ta, 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 ti, ti, ta. Rest. Ta, 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 ti, ti, ta. And so for using our scrapers or if you're using your hands, either way, it's going to be like this. Ta, 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 ti, ti, ta. Ta, 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 ti, ti, ta. And you do that pattern, the one line through 8 times. Second line is ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, 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 ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, 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 ta. And you can just follow along with me. Then we'll skip on ahead. The next part we have is, it says, oh, went back. Go back. Went too far. So you've got 3 half notes and then 2 rest. And you repeat it also 8 times. You've got half note, half note, half note, rest, rest, half note, half note, half note, rest, rest. Right, so that one's pretty self-explanatory. This is a little bit more challenging to go through, but you can do it. Remember, the chi-tis and tas, we're just going to clap together. The only ones that we're going to scrape are the half notes. So this top line, you're going to repeat it 1 time. So let's look at it. We have ti, 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 ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, 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 ta, ti, ti, ta. Let's just try that 1 line. Here you go. Ti, 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 ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, 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 ta, ti, ti, ta. Then you go on down to the next line. This line is repeated twice. So you'll have ta, ta, ti, 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 ta. Again, ta, ta, ti, 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 ta. Come down to this line, and it's ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ti. Let's try that one. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ti. And the last line is just ti, ti, tas. Ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta. Let's go through this whole page, and then while we're going through the real thing, it actually might seem easier just to follow along. But let's go through it one more time. So repeat this first line, and then the rest, each line is done individually. 1, 2, and here we go. Ti, 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 ta. Ti, ti, ta. Again. Ti, 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 ta. Ti, ti, ta. Ta, ta, ti, 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 ta. Ta, ta, ti, 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 ta. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ti. Ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta. And if you're feeling like this is a challenge and you're like, I can't do this, don't give up. Do the best to follow along, and then you can also go and do the body percussion with it too in a little bit. All right, we're going to skip on just a little bit to the end. And the very ending, we've got those 3 half notes again, but instead of the rest this time, we're going to clap, clap, clap at the end. And you'll see the blue and reds, and we'll do something different with that later on. For right now, we're playing all the parts. So it's going to be ta, 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 ti, ti, ta. Okay, I'm going to stop this video, and then I'll record the actual video with the Stars and Stripes Forever playing on top of that slide. So be looking for that in just a minute.